Welcome back. We're going to be working on using papier-mâché. You notice that box, we're using Elmer's papier-mâché paste, and it makes an entire bucket of paste. So you'll see down at the bottom I have a bunch of strips of newspaper torn up and ready to go. I'm going to just dip my fingers in the paste and then I can rub the paste into the newspaper. You don't need a whole bunch to get going, and once it's ready it's going to feel soft. It's going to be kind of transparent and it'll mold easily to fit the shape of your project. So usually when I start paper macheing, I make sure that I'm covering the weakest areas first. So if you noticed at the beginning, the tape was starting to kind of come up on the back of this creature. So I'm starting here to kind of push everything back down and make sure that it dries nice and sturdy. So we'll speed things up a little bit as we go along. So I'm overlapping the pieces and working in one area at a time, and that helps create a nice strong papier-mâché coating when we're finished. When your paper is really ready to go, you'll notice that it tears very easily, and this is really beneficial when you're working, because if you notice that your paper starts to have bumps or wrinkles when you lay it down, it is best to kind of tear it so that you get a smaller piece and you can work with a smaller piece that way and wrap it around so it fits. So generally, large areas like the back and stomach of these creatures take larger pieces, but then you have to start kind of ripping them down to make sure that they wrap around curves and fit into smaller crevices as we go. As you can see, I'm using smaller strips now to kind of wrap around areas, and I'm overlapping. It's very important that you overlap and kind of go in multiple directions. It's going to make sure that your stuff stays down when it dries. And the first coat of papier-mâché is usually the most difficult coat to do. It doesn't like to stick to the tape so much, but once you have one coat down, then it's pretty easy. You'll notice I'm using really small pieces around the ears and attaching it by going halfway on the ear, halfway on the body. That's going to really help secure it so that nothing falls off. So you don't just want to have papier-mâché on the ear and then papier-mâché on the body. You want to be on both. So here we've let it dry and we're flipping it over to do the other side. It usually takes about 3 to 4 hours to dry completely, depending on the amount of paste. Sometimes it takes overnight if you used a lot of paste. And it's a really good idea to make sure that you only do one side at a time. That way it doesn't stick to the table when it dries, or make sure that it actually dries completely all the way. So you'll see I'm using larger strips to cover the bigger areas, and then once it starts to go over curves, you're going to have to start using smaller pieces as you go along. And just like with the ears, it's really important that you get into the joints of like where the arms and legs are attached. So you're going across, like halfway on the arm, halfway on the body, and then going across, almost like how we attached it with the tape when we were building the armature. And then when that dries, it's going to be very hard and nice and secure. So you can see I'm kind of putting that in halfway, half and half going across. That really helps secure everything in place. And larger strips kind of work well when you're wrapping around something like arms, legs, tail. You can make it wrap all the way around, and actually that's better if it does wrap all the way around, because then you can secure it, the newspaper, to itself. Then you don't have to worry about it falling off later. And what's great about the paper mache is once you get enough paste on your hand, you don't have to dip every time you grab a piece of paper. You can do multiple pieces of paper on your hands just because you have a lot of paste there already. And usually, if there's huge puddles of papier-mâché paste underneath you, you're probably using too much. However, on the other hand, if your paste isn't very shiny, or your newspaper isn't very shiny, then usually you're probably not going to use enough, and then it's going to fall off when it dries. So it's important that you make note of how much paste you're using. You want to have just the right amount. And we've let this dry overnight. We've got our coats of paper mache, so now we're going to experiment with using tissue paper. So tissue paper is transparent, so I'm using it for the wings because I want bat wings to kind of look like those membranes of real bats, kind of see-through. And what I'm trying to do with the tissue paper is make kind of a gradient, so going from dark red up to a yellow-orange. So I've got about 4 different kinds of tissue paper, and because the tissue paper is so soft, we have to turn it upside down to work with because it was kind of collapsing on itself. So you can see I've gone from a dark red up to an orange, and then I'll be adding on a yellow orange at the end, and making sure to wrap tightly around the armature and around the wire to keep the same curves. We want to make sure this dries upside down completely so that it holds its shape. And when you use tissue paper, you'll have to be careful. It does stain your hands and your clothes and everything else. And to finish, I'm going to sculpt my beak and my claws with plaster gauze. So I've cut a bunch of strips ahead of time, and once I get the plaster gauze going, I can start to mold it with my fingers and sort of create that beak-like shape. And then I'm going to go over the top of the eyes to give it eyelids. That's going to give it sort of a fierce look depending on the direction that the eyelids are going. So you can see I'm sort of building up the nostril area of the beak right now. And then kind of the division between the upper and lower part of the beak. And then here we have the eyelid coming on right now. So depending on the direction of the eyelid, it could be confused, it could be happy, it could be angry, just depending on the shape you create with the eyelid. And if you get any extra gauze on the eyes, it comes off really easily when it's dry. So now we're moving on to the claws and just kind of wrapping the gauze around tightly over the claws to create a sharp point. It'll make them nice and hard and sturdy. And once I'm finished with this, we're essentially done with the paper macheing and armature, so we'll be ready for painting and decoration. So stay tuned for that next video.